There are many architects who have become famous enough, or infamous enough, to have become household names. Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, the infamous, Michelangelo, Louis Leveau, Mies van der Rohe, Norman Foster, Thomas Jefferson, etc. At least one or two of those are likely at least familiar. But while this was obviously written to set up another architect who is less well known, you will know many of the buildings he worked on, which are some of the most recognizable and visited places in France, influenced many of the architects already discussed. His work towards saving and documenting the most precious medieval monuments in France, and by extension all of Europe, should have earned him a greater recognition outside of France along with the famous French monuments he helped save, such as Notre-Dame, Carcassonne, and Sainte-Chapelle, as well as the fact that he designed parts of the Statue of Liberty. But surprisingly few people know of the man who was behind saving or creating so many iconic landmarks in the 19th century. This is the story of the architect who saved medieval France, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. Eugène-Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc was born on the 27th of January 1814 at the end of the First French Empire. Born into a family of civil servants and artists, where his father worked for the palace household of the empire, the restored Bourbons, and eventually the last king of the French, Louis Philippe, his uncle Etienne Jean de Lecluse was an accomplished student of Jacques-Louis David, a name which appears often on this channel. Already drawing by the age of 5, his uncle quickly recognized his talent and continued his studies. After passing his baccalaureate in 1830 at the age of 16, his uncle de Lecluse recognized his talent and suggested he apply for the École des Beaux-Arts and try for the famed Prix de Rome, a prize which would see artists compete for a spot to be sent to study art in Rome at the expense of the French government. Quickly, Leduc realized he wanted no part of what was then the standard education in architecture in the mid-19th century, which was very much that of a classic tradition. What this meant in practical terms was that by the mid-1800s, classicism had become so ingrained in the École des Beaux-Arts that the Gothic style, that was characteristic of medieval France, was seen as something not even worth preserving, let alone emulating, which was exactly the kind of architecture that Leduc was most interested in learning from. A recent biographer describes Leduc's thoughts on his early education well. "The school," wrote Eugène on December 3, 1831 in his diary, "is a mold for architects, they all come out the same." He did not want a master. He wanted to learn his profession through the study of monuments, and mocking the institute, refused more than ever to seek to run for the Prix de Rome, antechamber of glory. However, almost all of the great architects of the time, Labrouste, Verdoyer, Beltard, and later Garnier, were or would be winners of the Prix de Rome. Having won the Prix de Rome would, however, have opened many doors for him and silenced the critics. He was in fact choosing, not without pride, a perilous path. Thus, by Leduc staying out of the orthodoxy, he had positioned himself to save the architecture that other architects had deemed not worth saving. By feigning the normal route to success, he would become a towering figure in the revival and preservation of medieval architecture in Europe. Having not chosen to go the traditional route, Leduc would choose a much more interesting path to becoming a professional artist and architect. He would personally go out into France and see the country's historical heritage for himself. As one historian would say, the young man was eager to discover French architecture and monuments, and de Lecluse, his painter uncle, decided to take him on a trip at his own expense. This first journey, accompanied by his uncle, would mark the beginning of many journeys across France, intended to observe and study and even, as Eugène would later say, to understand the soul of our country. It's also worth noting, traveling around the French countryside at this point in history, the mid-19th century, was still a difficult task, as it took 66 hours alone to go from Paris to Lyon, whereas now it only takes 2 hours on the TGV. So for someone to go out and investigate France, rather than stay in Paris or go live in Rome, says something about the man. It is from this first journey with his uncle and his later journeys across France, painting and sketching as he went, where he would assemble his vast knowledge of French historical architecture, and it is with this knowledge that he would eventually assemble his Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture française, or the Dictionary of French Architecture from the 11th to 16th centuries, which is still one of the most comprehensive ever assembled of the time period. Often, he would return again and again to certain regions to solidify his understanding of its monuments or revisit the same ones to study again. Between 1832 and 1836, for example, quote, he made yearly pilgrimages to Normandy and Chartres to draw medieval monuments. His trips to Normandy are considered crucial by several historians for its impact on him, but it was on these trips he went solely for medieval studies, where his earlier trips had included a whole smattering of other architectural styles, mainly Roman ruins in the south of France. We can also be confident that we know these trips were not simply vacations or travels to simply see these monuments. We know exactly how hard he worked based on the amount of sketches and drawings he produced. We also have one of his friend's diaries who accompanied him on a trip to Chartres. From this, we know that Leduc would spend 12 hours a day studying and drawing the cathedral, leaving his friend to figure out what he would do in the meantime. On one trip to the Pyrenees in 1833, Le-Duc would draw 173 drawings in 134 days. Surely all of his hard work in the field made up for all the education he was missing out on at the École in Paris. In 1830, when Le-Duc was 16, after the Revolution, this is the second, mind you, where King Louis-Philippe came to power, Eugène's father was named governor of the Élysée Palace, and eventually the governor of the Tuileries Palace and the head of the royal residences, of which a king of France still had many: Versailles, Fontainebleau, Saint-Cloud, Compiègne, and Pau. As part of this position, Le-Duc's family eventually moved into the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris, mainly known to us today by surviving remnants, the Louvre. While clearly Eugène would benefit from the inside connections of having one's father being quite literally in the royal circle, during his entire career he never received any commissions to work on any of the royal palaces. It was during these early years of Eugène's time in Paris that we have some fantastic paintings, which give us a glimpse into his life and the life of a man at court in the mid-19th century. During his time as a young man living in the Tuileries, he would paint paintings of the goings-on, such as the grand parties held by the king during that era. Between continuing to travel France and becoming more and more enthralled with its medieval Gothic architecture in particular, and quite literally living at the royal palace in Paris, we get a sense of who the young Le-Duc was becoming. And the contrast between the two settings really helps explain a lot and helps set the scene. He's either in the palace or court of the king or out in the middle of nowhere looking at buildings falling apart. Having slowly been making connections in Paris, in 1840 he caught his break. He eventually got the attention of those in the newly minted Commission de Monuments Historiques, which was only 3 years old, and its Inspector General Prosper Mérimée. As one author colorfully writes, "For the next 40 years, this commission would hold a greater place in Eugène's life than his wife." An interesting character in his own right for having written the novella Carmen, which would later become the basis of Bizet's opera of the same name, he was also instrumental in the protection and restoration of historical monuments in France, having been in charge of the Historical Monuments Commission and having published the first official list of historical monuments in France in 1840, with a grand total of 1,082 historic monuments including 934 buildings. Part of the commission's task was to preserve and restore these buildings. One of the first monuments deemed in need of urgent repair and restoration was Vizelay Abbey. In the search for someone to restore the abbey, he discovered that no one but the young architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc was willing to take the task. Prosper Mérimée was taking a fairly large risk on Le-Duc, and it was probably a combination of Le-Duc's evident talent and family connections, as Mérimée knew his uncle. The risk being that Le-Duc had never officially studied architecture, never gone through the Academy of Beaux-Arts in Paris, and had never really had a real job of this magnitude before. But no one else was willing to take the job. Mérimée would ask Delacluse if his nephew was up to the task, to which he responded, "If Eugène said he would take care of it, don't worry, he will succeed." As one historian succinctly puts it, so at 26-year-old, having yet, let us repeat, not accomplished anything, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc found himself confronted with the task of the first magnitude. We even still have one of the original watercolors when he first got to the abbey, which shows its true state of disrepair. Basically, his task was to simply stop the abbey from falling in on itself, as that was the most pressing concern. It was noted as being an extremely difficult job, as no one actually knew the necessary practical details of how medieval structure was constructed, other than what you could see on the surface. The actual techniques, which would be necessary to know and understand to be able to properly preserve and restore these medieval buildings, was simply lost to time. The year he was working on this, in 1840, the same year the first list of historical monuments was published in France, means we are right at the beginning of historical preservation. And he was one of the pioneers in this field of rediscovering how these monuments were built in order to preserve them. It would take over 20 years to finish the work on Vizelay Abbey. But one of the other most impressive things about Le-Duc, he did not just work on one project at a time, otherwise he would have probably only finished 3 things in his lifetime. So by the end of 1840, he had gotten involved in his next project, Sainte-Chapelle. And although he was very much at that stage an underling and not the main architect in charge by any means, to be put on something as important as the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris was an extremely big deal. So, after only a few years after completing his quote-unquote education, he had acquired a few jobs, was progressing, doing some decent work, and even after only a few years after starting work for the government, Le-Duc would receive one of the most important restoration projects of his career. Many churches are named Notre-Dame in France. Like a lot. But when someone says Notre-Dame, they're almost certainly talking about Notre-Dame de Paris. Probably one of the most well-known cathedrals in the world, it is also the quintessential example of a Gothic French church. Started in the 12th century, like all these massive Gothic cathedrals, it was worked on for the next 200 years, being largely finished in the 14th century. However, for many centuries, Notre-Dame was not the most important French cathedral by a long margin. In purely religious terms, it only became the seat of an archbishop in the 17th century, whereas before Paris only had a bishop, who was still under the archbishopric of Sens. In terms of size, it's neither the tallest cathedral in France, does not even make the top 10, or the largest by volume. Also, the top 3 tallest are also called Notre-Dame, by the way. Even in Paris, yes, although its central location has given it importance, historically other churches were more important. During the Ancien Regime, the Basilica of Saint-Denis was much more important in Paris, or nearby Paris, as it was the traditional burial place of French kings. Speaking of, the coronation of French kings also did not take place at Notre-Dame, or even in Paris. French kings were coronated in Reims. There are, however, 2 exceptions. In 1431, Henry VI was coronated King of France in Notre-Dame, as the French were in control of Reims. While technically he was the legal heir to both kingdoms after the death of his grandfather Charles VI of France, the result of the 100 Years' War put an end to that. And we'll get to the other exception in a moment. Over time, Notre-Dame was repeatedly renovated and changed as the times demanded, such as multiple times in the 18th century, where stained glass was replaced with white stained glass to make the interior brighter, a common practice, as well as simple reinforcement work for things such as the flying buttresses. However, under the French Revolution, starting in 1789, with its anti-Catholic and anti-religious phase especially, Notre-Dame was eventually nationalized along with all other church property in France, and first turned into a temple of reason, and then into a temple of the cult of the Supreme Being, before being used as a wine warehouse. By this point in the late 1790s, the building was simply not being maintained. It was also the case that the anti-Catholic revolutionaries defaced large sections of the cathedral, probably most famously the statues of the kings from the Bible, thinking they were kings of France, the other big thing everyone hated other than the church in the French Revolution. And in classic French revolutionary style, once these statues were taken down, they were beheaded. Funnily enough, we actually still have the heads, having discovered them in someone's courtyard in the 1970s, and you can actually see them at one of the museums in Paris. After Napoleon's brief reconciliation with the church after the Concordat in 1802, Notre-Dame once again became a Catholic place of worship. Then in 1804, Notre-Dame would have its first coronation in 373 years. Although extremely dilapidated, missing its spire and most of its decorations, Napoleon chose Notre-Dame as the location for his coronation as Emperor of the French. Napoleon had the whole cathedral decorated for his coronation, partly to hide, at this point, heavily vandalized and ill-kept cathedral, with whole facades being built and tapestries covering large parts of the cathedral. Despite this superficial coat of paint, quite literally as they whitewashed the cathedral, it did not slow or fix the actual problems with the building, and it would take until 1831 for anything to be even thought to be done about it. Napoleon's coronation was the second and last ever coronation held in Notre-Dame, but probably the most famous in French history, partly due to Napoleon himself and Jacques-Louis David's depiction. In fact, there was only one other coronation ceremony after Napoleon was coronated in Notre-Dame, and it was in Reims with Charles X, as Louis XVIII, Louis Philippe, and Napoleon III did not have coronations, or as the French would say, sacres. One of Victor Hugo's most famous books, The Hunchback of Notre Dame in English, was literally published in part as a way to raise awareness about the cathedral as it was in such bad shape. And the name of the book in French is Notre-Dame de Paris. There's no hunchback or anything. The name of the book is literally the name of the cathedral. Thus, an outpouring of public support and a new mandate from the French government to maintain historical buildings meant that, in 1843, Le Duc and another architect were chosen to lead the restoration work on the cathedral. The list of what they had to accomplish was long. In addition, there was apparently some discussion as to whether to finish Notre Dame. Once you have seen many other French cathedrals, it becomes quite clear what is meant by this. Notre Dame is unique in the fact that it does not have at least one enormous tower on the front facade of the cathedral. For example, compare Notre Dame with Le Duc's concept of an ideal Gothic cathedral, or with some real cathedrals in France, which are larger and grander than Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, Amiens, Rouen, to name a few. Thus, there was at least slight discussion of whether to put spires on top of the existing towers. But it has been argued that Le Duc never seriously considered quote-unquote finishing Notre Dame's 2 towers. And while Le Duc actually made a drawing of what Notre Dame might look like with 2 spires, he never seriously considered doing that to the cathedral. Le Duc even said, "Do we believe that this monument would benefit from the construction of 2 spires of a very hypothetical shape above the 2 towers? We do not think so. And even assuming complete success, we would perhaps obtain a remarkable monument through this addition, but this monument would no longer be Notre-Dame de Paris." But probably the most recognizable thing he did other than just improve the general condition of the entire building by replacing the kings and the statues on the facade, as well as just general restoration, was building a new spire to replace the one that had been removed in the late 18th century. In modern Paris, it has become a familiar sight over the last several years for Notre Dame not to have a spire. During Le-Duc's time, he had never actually seen a spire in that spot. It had been dismantled in the late 1780s and early 1790s due to fear of it collapsing because it was almost 600 years old. Hence why in drawings and engravings of Napoleon's coronation, there is no spire. Thus for nearly 50 years, Notre-Dame had gone without its spire. But Le-Duc would give it back. And impressively, his design for the new spire was so well loved that when the third tower had to be built after the 2019 fire, it was decided to reuse Viollet-le-Duc's design. Thus, Le-Duc helped restore and save Notre-Dame not just in the 19th century, but the 21st century as well. However impressive Le-Duc's renovation of Notre-Dame de Paris was, and is, he did much more than just Notre-Dame. Some of France's most well-known and preserved monuments were also restored by none other than Le-Duc. Mont Saint-Michel and Carcassonne, and many slightly lesser-known ones such as Pierrefonds, as well as many other major cathedrals throughout France. Towards the end of his career, he's also known for being fairly innovative in his use of steel and metal in preserving structures. For example, in the Château de Pierrefonds, what you might think would be wood in the ceiling are actually metal beams designed to look like medieval woodwork. In some of his designs that never actually got made, in particular this one, you can see are moving away from medieval restoration and into an almost completely new category of their own, with some architectural historians crediting him with being the precursor or even the very start of the Art Nouveau movement in France. Admittedly, Le-Duc usually didn't design entirely new structures, just saved old ones, which I guess is part of the reason he is not as well known. But his innovative and sometimes contentious renovations and restorations and his few new works, I think, deserve to put him in the canon of household names. Especially for the fact that he was at the beginning of the movement and a key player in making sure that medieval France was not lost to time.